My name is Marisol Ibarra. I am 31 years old, and for most of my life I believed that if you worked hard enough inside a family, the family would eventually see it. I was wrong. I'll start with what I was because the rest of this doesn't make sense without it. I managed the finances for a small residential property portfolio, 12 units across 3 buildings in the outer ring of Phoenix, Arizona. Not glamorous. Not the kind of thing that gets mentioned at dinner parties. What it meant, in practical terms, was that I collected rent, negotiated vendor contracts, tracked maintenance costs against quarterly budgets, filed the annual statements, and handled every conversation with the property management attorney when something needed to go to paper. The records I kept, every contract, every lease, every invoice, every maintenance log, lived in a folder on my laptop labeled simply Ibarra Properties, and beside it on my desk sat the 3-ring binder where I kept the printed versions organized by year. That binder had not moved from my desk in 3 years. The portfolio didn't belong to me. It belonged to my father, Ernesto Ibarra, who had spent 22 years building it from a single duplex he bought when my mother was pregnant with my older sister, Gabriella. He was proud of those buildings the way some men are proud of their children, with a specific and slightly irrational love that made it hard for him to see them clearly. He knew the address of every unit. He knew which tenant in Building 2 kept a dog against lease terms and chose not to enforce it because the woman was 73 and the dog was small. He knew these things because I told him in the weekly summary I emailed every Sunday evening without being asked. I want you to think about something if you're watching this right now, if you have ever been the one in your family who actually kept things running, who did the unglamorous, thankless, invisible work, and still somehow ended up as the one who didn't quite measure up. If that's you, I need you to stay with me because this story is going to go somewhere. What my father did not fully know, or chose not to fully know, was how much of the actual operational weight I had been carrying since his back surgery 3 years earlier had slowed him down. Before the surgery, he ran the day-to-day himself, and I helped. After the surgery, I ran the day-to-day, and he reviewed. That distinction mattered more than either of us said out loud. My mother, Lorena, worked part-time at a dental office 2 days a week. She had her routines, her opinions, and a very clear picture of which of her 2 daughters had turned out the way she'd hoped. Gabriella was 34, married to a man named Patrick who worked in pharmaceutical sales, and lived in a newer subdivision 20 minutes north of my parents' house. Gabriella was warm and social and remembered every birthday and was, according to my mother's informal ranking system, the daughter who had figured out how life was supposed to go. I was the one who had not married, had not moved to the right neighborhood, and who showed up to Sunday dinners with spreadsheets open on my phone. My apartment was a 12-minute drive from my parents' house. I kept it that way on purpose. Close enough to be useful, far enough to have somewhere to go at the end of the day that belonged only to me. My work week looked like this. Monday mornings I pulled the receivables report and flagged anything past 5 days. Tuesdays I handled maintenance calls, which meant coordinating between tenants who were frustrated and vendors who needed specific instruction or they'd overcharge. Thursdays I reviewed whatever invoices had come in and matched them against the approved vendor list. Fridays I prepared the weekly summary for my father. On top of that, anytime a lease came up for renewal, anytime a unit turned over, anytime there was a plumbing failure or an HVAC issue or a dispute between neighbors that someone thought required a letter, that was me. I had a folder on my laptop labeled simply Ibarra Properties that had not been closed in 3 years. My father paid me. Not generously. We had agreed on a monthly management fee that sat at the lower end of what a third-party property manager would have charged, but he paid me, and I had never asked for more because I told myself the arrangement had other value. I was learning the portfolio. I understood it the way you understand something when you've handled every part of it with your own hands. Someday I thought that would mean something. That thought was the thing I was wrong about. The dinner where it happened was in October, on a Sunday, the kind of evening that comes in cool through the back screen door and makes the kitchen smell like something is finally the right temperature again. My mother had made pozole. She made it the way her own mother had made it, which meant it had been on the stove since early afternoon and the whole house held the smell when you walked in. Gabriella and Patrick were already there when I arrived. Gabriella was at the counter helping arrange the garnish bowls. Sliced radish, shredded cabbage, dried oregano, lime wedges in a small dish, the way she always arranged things, with an instinct for how things should look that I had never quite inherited. Patrick was at the kitchen table talking to my father about something in the news. I set my bag down by the door and washed my hands at the sink. We sat down. My mother served. There was the ordinary conversation that fills the first part of any family dinner. Patrick's work, Gabriella's neighbor who was redoing her front yard, a cousin's upcoming quinceañera. My father mentioned that the HVAC contractor had called him directly about the unit in Building 3, and I said I had already rescheduled the inspection for the following week. He nodded. That was the full extent of the work conversation. Somewhere around the second bowl, my mother looked across the table at me and asked when I was going to think about doing something more with my life. I had heard some version of this question before. I set my spoon down and said I was doing something. I ran the property management for Dad's portfolio. My mother made a small sound. Not dismissive exactly, more like she was making room for a more important thought. She said that Gabriella had mentioned a position opening at the dental office, front desk, full benefits, and that it might be good for me to have something more structured. Something with regular hours. Something that was, she said, a real job. I looked at the table for a moment. I picked my spoon back up. My father did not say anything. He broke a tostada in half over his bowl. Patrick had found something to look at on his phone. Gabriella said gently that she just thought maybe I would be happier somewhere with more people around. She smiled when she said it, which was the part that stayed with me longer than the words. I said I was fine where I was. My mother said, almost to herself, that Gabriella had always known what she wanted. That she had never needed to be told twice. That some people had that instinct for the right thing and some people had to figure it out the long way. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was ladling more broth into her bowl. The words landed the way words land when someone has decided not to be responsible for them. My chest felt tight for a moment, not anger exactly, something closer to the specific loneliness of being misread by someone who has known you your whole life. I squared my napkin in my lap and said nothing. The conversation moved on. We talked about Patrick's brother's new car. We talked about whether the quinceañera venue would have enough parking. My mother told a story about a patient at the dental office who had been rude to the hygienist. I helped clear the plates when dinner was over. I washed the large pozole pot because it didn't fit easily in the dishwasher and my mother's back bothered her when she stood at the sink too long. Gabriella dried it and put it away without being asked, and my mother said, watching her, that Gabriella had always been so thoughtful. Just like that. Out loud. In the kitchen, with me standing 2 feet away holding the dish towel. I folded the dish towel into a smaller square and draped it over the oven handle and did not answer. I drove home that night with the windows down. The air was still cool. I had the radio on low and I didn't really hear it. I kept thinking about the word my mother had used, structured, as though what I did every day had no structure to it, as though the receivables reports and the vendor contracts and the lease renewals were a kind of pleasant wandering rather than work that held the portfolio together. I thought about it for a few days and then I filed it away in the place I kept things I couldn't fix. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. What I didn't know yet was how much further this was going to go before it was over. The October dinner was not an isolated incident. It was a point on a line that had been drawing itself for years, and the line went back far enough that I had stopped noticing the shape of it. I was 24 when my father first asked me to help with the properties. He had just added the second building. 8 units, older construction, needed a full vendor assessment before any of the leases were renewed. He asked me to spend a weekend going through the maintenance logs and telling him what I found. I had just finished an associate's degree in business administration, and I was working a front desk job at a real estate office, which meant I knew how to read a lease, knew what a late fee clause was supposed to say, knew the difference between a capital improvement and a maintenance repair for tax purposes. I spent that weekend with the logs spread out on my parents' kitchen table, and I put together a 3-page summary with a recommended vendor contact list and a priority ranking for the deferred maintenance items. My father read it and said simply that it was good work. He asked if I wanted to keep helping. I said yes. Gabriella had been living in her first apartment with Patrick by then. They were not yet married. She came to Sunday dinner that weekend and my mother showed her the summary I had written. Not because my mother thought it was impressive, I understood later, but because she was proud that I had done something useful for Dad, and she was showing Gabriella the way you show someone a drawing a younger child made. Gabriella said it looked complicated and that she didn't know how I kept track of all of it. My mother said I had always been the detail-oriented one, in the tone of voice that made detail-oriented sound like a consolation prize. I managed Building 2's full unit turnover when the original property manager retired and my father decided not to hire a replacement. That was the year I was 26. 4 units turned over in the same quarter. I coordinated the cleaning crews, the carpet replacements, the repainting of 2 units that needed it, the updated lease agreements, the move-in inspections, and the background checks on new tenants. I did it alongside my front desk job, in the evenings and on weekends, and the portfolio absorbed the transitions without a gap in occupancy. My father thanked me. He bought me dinner at the restaurant I liked near my apartment. It was a good evening. When I mentioned it to my mother later, she said that it was nice that I could help Dad, and that Gabriella had signed up to volunteer at Patrick's company's charity auction that same month and had apparently been wonderful with the donors. She said Gabriella had a gift for people. I had managed the lease renewal audit for all 12 units the year I was 27, after the city updated its residential landlord-tenant code and my father's attorney said everything needed to be reviewed for compliance. I worked through the leases one by one, flagged the clauses that needed updating, drafted the revised language, and coordinated with the attorney to get the final version signed and filed. It took 6 weeks. My father's attorney told him directly that the audit had been unusually thorough. My father passed this along to me at Sunday dinner, and my mother said that was good, and then told a longer story about Gabriella's promotion at the interior design firm where she had worked briefly before she left to be a full-time homemaker. I had negotiated the current contract with the primary HVAC vendor the year I was 28. The previous vendor had been overcharging on parts for at least 2 years. I found it when I started pulling the invoice history against manufacturer pricing. I brought 3 competing bids to my father, walked him through the comparison, and recommended the switch. The new vendor's contract saved the portfolio just under $11,000 in the first year. My father signed the contract. He told me I had done well. That same year at Christmas, my mother gave Gabriella a piece of jewelry that had belonged to her own mother, a small gold bracelet with a single charm. She gave it to Gabriella in front of everyone at the table after dinner. She said Gabriella reminded her most of her mother. She said her mother had always had grace. I watched my sister accept the bracelet. I watched her turn it over in her hands, her eyes wet. I watched my father reach over and squeeze my mother's hand. I went to the kitchen and filled a glass of water and stood at the sink for a moment with my back to the room. I didn't say anything. I came back to the table and I helped clear the dishes, and then I drove home and I did the Sunday report the next morning like I did every Sunday morning. The labor of those years was not invisible in the way that some labor is invisible, hidden, unacknowledged, never mentioned. My father mentioned it. He thanked me. He paid the management fee. But gratitude, I was learning, and value are not the same thing. Gratitude is what you offer something useful. Value is what you offer something irreplaceable. I had spent 7 years being useful. I had managed 31 unit turnovers across the portfolio in that time, coordinating vendors, inspections, and new lease execution each time. I had reduced the average unit vacancy window from 41 days to 17 days through a combination of earlier listing timelines and pre-approved vendor scheduling. I had built and maintained the vendor contact system that my father now referenced as though it had always existed. I had drafted or reviewed every lease document that had been signed in the last 5 years. I had fielded every maintenance emergency call. The burst pipe at 2 in the morning, the heating failure in February, the tenant dispute that required a formal notice letter before it went quiet, and resolved every one of them before my father had to be involved. None of this was in the family story. The family story had me as the detail-oriented one, the helper, the daughter who had not quite figured out what she wanted. Gabriella was the one who had figured it out. The Sunday dinner in February was my father's 63rd birthday. My mother had made carnitas this time, low and slow in the big Dutch oven, and there was rice and a cucumber salad and the kind of cake from the Mexican bakery 2 streets over that my father had requested every year for as long as I could remember. Gabriella and Patrick arrived first again. I arrived 10 minutes after them, carrying a card and a bottle of the Rioja my father preferred. Dinner was good. My father was in a better mood than he'd been in months. His back had been bothering him through the winter, and he had finally started a new round of physical therapy that seemed to be helping. He told a story about a conversation he'd had with one of his oldest tenants, the woman in Building 2 with the small dog, who had brought him a handwritten card when she heard it was his birthday. He was genuinely moved by it. I had been the one who mentioned to the tenant in December that his birthday was in February. I didn't say that. After the cake, after the candles, after Patrick's toast that was warm and slightly too long, my father said he wanted to talk about something. He said he had been thinking about the future of the portfolio. I set my fork down. He said that his back wasn't going to get better the way he had originally hoped, and that the physical therapy was helping with day-to-day function, but that his attorney had strongly advised him to think about succession planning. He said he had been having conversations about this for a few months. A few months. He said he had decided that he wanted to restructure the ownership of the portfolio, formally through a family trust, and that he wanted to talk to all of us together before anything was finalized. My mother was nodding. Not the way you nod when you are hearing something new. The way you nod when the thing being said is already familiar. Gabriella reached across the table and put her hand over my father's. She said she thought that was a wise decision. Her voice was soft and warm. Patrick said the same thing a moment later, essentially about being glad Dad was thinking ahead. I said carefully that I thought a trust was a sensible structure, and that I was glad he had been talking to his attorney. I asked if the attorney was the same one I had been working with on the lease documentation. My father said no. He said he had been working with a different attorney on this, an estate planning specialist his accountant had referred him to. He said the estate planning attorney had helped him think through a few different structures. I asked what structures he was considering. There was a pause. Not long. My father looked at my mother for a moment. Just briefly, just a glance, and then he said that one of the options on the table was transferring day-to-day operational control to someone who could be more hands-on as his own involvement decreased. I said I was already hands-on. I had been running the day-to-day for 3 years. My father said he knew that, and that he was grateful for everything I had done, and that this wasn't about my work. He said it was about what made sense for the long term, for the family as a whole. My mother said, into the small silence that followed, that they just wanted to make sure the properties were in the right hands. She didn't look at me when she said it. She was looking at Gabriella. My pulse caught, just once, just a single beat that I felt in my throat, and then I was very still. I picked up my water glass and took a slow drink and set it back down. I said I understood. I said I would be glad to sit down with the estate planning attorney whenever that made sense. I said I wanted to make sure the transition, whatever form it took, was smooth. My father said that was generous. He said he knew I would be professional about it. Professional. The words sat there on the table with the birthday cake crumbs and the half-empty glasses and the used dessert forks. The conversation moved on to other things. Patrick asked about the tenant with the dog. My mother talked about whether the bakery had changed its carnitas recipe. My father laughed at something Patrick said about birthday cake and turning 63. I stayed for another 40 minutes. I helped stack the dishes. I hugged my father and told him happy birthday, and I meant it because whatever was happening with the portfolio, he was still my father and it was still his birthday. I said goodnight to my mother. I said goodnight to Gabriella, who hugged me and said it was good to see me and seemed, as far as I could tell, entirely at ease. I drove home in the dark. By the time I got to my apartment, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I had been building toward it for 3 years without knowing it. Every system I had built, every document I had organized, every record I had kept, all of it was in the folder on my laptop and in the binder on my desk. And inside that binder was something my father's estate planning attorney had not seen yet. Something that was going to change the conversation about whose hands the right hands were. I made a cup of coffee. I opened my laptop. I found the number for my own attorney, the one I had consulted twice before on the lease documentation work, the one who had told me to keep records of everything. I had kept records of everything. I called her the next morning. My attorney's name was Sandra Ruiz, and she had a corner office on the fourth floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. I had called her the morning after my father's birthday dinner, and we had spent 40 minutes on the phone before she told me to come in. I came in the following Thursday with a flash drive and the binder. She spent 2 weeks reviewing what I gave her. Then she told me what I had. What I had was 7 years of documented labor. Every vendor contract I had negotiated, every lease document I had drafted or reviewed, every maintenance coordination log, every email to tenants, every invoice I had matched and flagged, every quarterly report I had prepared. I had email timestamps. I had the before and after vacancy numbers. I had the original vendor invoices against the new ones, showing the $11,000 first-year differential. I had the attorney's own written acknowledgement, in a letter to my father, that the lease audit I had conducted had been unusually thorough. Sandra read through all of it with the quiet attention of someone who is calculating something large. She said I had a strong claim to compensation for services rendered at a rate below market value over a sustained period, particularly given the documented scope expansion after my father's surgery. She said the question of the portfolio's future structure, the trust, the succession, was a separate matter but one that intersected with what I had. She said the estate planning attorney my father had retained had not, as far as she could determine, been given any documentation of my operational role. She said that was a significant gap. I told her I wanted to close the gap. She told me to let her make some calls. 3 weeks later, my father called and asked if I would come to a family meeting at the house. He said he and my mother wanted to go over the trust structure with everyone together. He said the estate planning attorney would be there and that it seemed like the right thing to do. I said of course. I said I would be there. I brought the binder. The meeting was on a Saturday morning. My mother had made coffee and set out a plate of pan dulce that no one touched. The estate planning attorney was a man named Gerald, silver-haired and precise, who had set up a small presentation on the dining room table, a single-page summary of the proposed trust structure with 3 printed copies fanned out like a hand of cards. Gabriella and Patrick sat on one side of the table. My father sat at the head. My mother sat to his left. I sat across from Gabriella with the binder on the table in front of me. Gerald walked through the structure. The trust would hold all 3 buildings. My father would remain the primary trustee for his lifetime. Upon his death or incapacity, operational control would transfer to a named successor trustee. Gerald paused here and looked at my father, who nodded. My father said he had named Gabriella as the successor trustee. The room was quiet for a moment. Gabriella looked at the table. Patrick put his hand on her arm. My mother said quietly that they felt it was the right choice for the family. I looked at my father. I said calmly that I had some documentation I wanted the group to see before anything was finalized. I said Sandra Ruiz, my attorney, had reviewed it and that it was relevant to the succession question. My father frowned, not angry, uncertain. He said he didn't know I had an attorney involved. I said I had retained her in a consulting capacity a few weeks ago, after our conversation at his birthday dinner. I said I wanted to make sure the process was complete. I reached into the binder. I took out the first document, a summary page Sandra had prepared, 2 columns, left side showing my documented scope of work by year, right side showing the standard market rate for those services from a third-party property manager. I placed it on the table. My father picked it up. Gerald leaned over to look at it. I placed the second document, the attorney's written acknowledgement of the lease audit. I placed the third, the vendor invoice comparison, with the $11,000 differential circled. I said I wanted to walk everyone through what the last 7 years had actually looked like. I did it quietly. I used the documents. I did not raise my voice. I went line by line through the summary page, naming the specific work and the specific years, and I watched my father's expression change as the full scope of it became visible to him. Not because he hadn't known I was working, but because he had never seen it laid out this way, as a totality, as a thing with a market value attached to it. When I finished, Gerald said nothing for a moment. Then he said, professionally and without drama, that this documentation was material to the succession question and would need to be reviewed before the trust structure was finalized. My mother said into the silence that she still thought Gabriella was the right choice. That Gabriella was responsible and trustworthy and that the family needed someone who could bring people together. I said I understood. My father said my name, just my name, quietly and stopped. Gabriella said she thought maybe they should take some time before finalizing anything. Her voice was careful. She was not looking at my mother. Patrick said nothing. He had stopped touching Gabriella's arm. Gerald began gathering his papers. He said he would be in touch with my father's accountant and would need a follow-up meeting before any documents were signed. I closed my binder. I stayed seated while Gerald packed his briefcase. My father was still holding the vendor comparison document, turning it over slightly as though looking at the back of it might clarify something. My mother refilled her coffee cup and did not sit back down. The room held a particular kind of quiet, the kind that comes not from an absence of things to say but from too many things arriving at once, and no one sure which one to pick up first. Gerald said, before he left, that he wanted to be direct with everyone in the room. The documentation I had presented created a legitimate question about equitable compensation that would need to be addressed as part of any formal succession structure. He said this was not unusual in family business arrangements, and that it was better to surface it now than after documents were signed. He said my father should call him Monday. My father said he would. Gerald shook my hand on the way out, then my father's, then said a polite goodbye to the room. The door closed. My mother set her coffee cup down. She said, looking at my father, that she didn't understand why I had felt the need to bring an attorney into a family matter. I said I hadn't brought Sandra to the meeting. I said I had simply used the documentation she helped me organize. My mother said it felt adversarial. I said I thought it felt accurate. My father called me the following Tuesday evening. He asked if I could come by the house. Just me, he said. Not a meeting. Just us. I came on Wednesday afternoon. My mother was at the dental office. My father was at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, which was something he did when he wanted a conversation to feel like a conversation and not like a negotiation. I sat down. I wrapped both hands around the mug. He said he had been thinking since Saturday. He said he owed me something and he wanted to say it directly. He had not understood fully what I had been doing for the last 3 years. He said the summary page had been hard to look at. Not because it was wrong, he said. Because it was right. I said I appreciated him saying that. He said he wanted to understand how we had gotten here. He said he didn't mean the documents, he meant the distance. He said he hadn't known I felt the way I felt. I thought about that for a moment. And then I told him. I said, you remember the dinner where Mom said I was the detail-oriented one? I was 24. You had just asked me to put together the maintenance assessment. She said it like it was a small thing. Like being detail-oriented was the consolation prize for not being Gabriella. He was quiet. I said, at your birthday dinner last February, when I asked what succession structures you were considering, you said you'd been having conversations for a few months. A few months, Dad. I had been managing the portfolio for 3 years by then. No one called me. He looked at his coffee. I said, at Christmas, when Mom gave Gabriella her mother's bracelet, she said Gabriella reminded her most of her mother, that her mother had grace. I went to the kitchen. I stood at the sink. I didn't say anything. I came back to the table and I helped clear the dishes, and then I drove home and I did the Sunday report the next morning like I did every Sunday morning. My father said my name again. The same way he had said it on Saturday. Like the name itself was the thing he was trying to hand me. I said, I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad about the bracelet or about Mom or about any of it. I'm telling you because you asked how we got here. That's how. I kept doing the work, and the work kept not counting in the story you were all telling about the family. And I let it go every time because I thought the work would eventually speak for itself. It turned out the work needed a binder. He laughed at that, a short, tired laugh. Then he was quiet for a long time. He said he had called Gerald on Monday. He said Gerald had recommended a different trust structure, one that formalized my operational role and tied compensation to documented scope, retroactively where possible, going forward as a stated rate. He said Gabriella was still named in the trust as a secondary trustee, but that the operational authority would reflect what was actually happening. I said that sounded right. He said he was sorry it had taken the binder. I said I was sorry too. My mother did not call me that week. She called Gabriella, and Gabriella called me, and we had a careful conversation where she said she had known, for a while, that things weren't even, and that she was sorry she hadn't said it sooner. I believed her. Gabriella had never been unkind. She had only ever been comfortable, which is a different thing, and comfort has its own kind of blindness. My mother came around in her own time, which is to say slowly, and without ever quite saying the word sorry out loud. What she said instead, 3 weeks later at Sunday dinner, was that she hadn't realized how much I was carrying. She said it looking at the table, not at me. I said I knew. And I let it be enough, because some apologies are the best a person can manage, and you can either take them or wait for a better one that may not come. The trust was finalized 6 weeks after the Saturday meeting. My name is in it. Not as a footnote, not as a detail, but as the operational trustee with a documented scope and a stated compensation rate that reflects what the work actually is. Gerald's office sent me a copy with a cover letter. I read it at my kitchen table with the coffee I make every morning before I open the laptop, before I pull the receivables report, before the week begins. I kept the binder. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because I built it alone, in the evenings, in my apartment, while I was still showing up to Sunday dinners and washing the pozole pot and driving home in the dark. It sits on the shelf above my desk now, next to the lease files and the vendor binder. It doesn't look like much. It's just a standard 3-ring binder with a printed label. But when I look at it, I think about all the things I told myself over the years. That the work would speak for itself, that the right people would eventually see it, that patience was the same thing as strategy. Patience is not the same thing as strategy. Patience without documentation is just waiting. I had to learn to turn one into the other. What I know now that I didn't know at 24 is that the people who love you are not always able to see you clearly. Not because they are cruel. My father is not a cruel man, but because families build their stories early, and the stories are stubborn. The detail-oriented daughter. The graceful one. The one who figured it out, and the one who was still figuring. Those stories get told so many times they start to feel like facts. And facts, someone once told me, respond to evidence. I had the evidence. I just had to organize it. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you have ever been the one doing the work that didn't make it into the family story, share this with someone who needs to hear it. You don't have to wait for someone to notice. You can build the binder. The events described in this story are fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.